The fire started the way many tragedies do, in silence and smoke. At first, neighbors thought it might be just another autumn night on the farm, the kind where the scent of dried corn husks drifts across the fields, and the crickets hum in steady rhythm. But soon, a glow appeared in the darkness, growing brighter and fiercer with every passing minute. The old corn barn, a century-old structure that had stood through storms, wars, and generations of toil, was now engulfed in flames. Its dry beams, aged by time and sun, caught like tinder, sending roaring waves of fire into the night sky. People gathered along the gravel road, helpless, their silhouettes lit by the inferno. They whispered, not only in shock at the destruction, but with a sense of suspicion. This didn't feel like an accident. Farmers know barns don't just burst into flames on their own. And this barn wasn't ordinary. It was the heart of one man's livelihood and a landmark everyone in the community recognized. As the fire climbed higher, sparks shot into the black sky, floating like fireflies before dying in the smoke. Families clutched their children close, some recording videos with shaking hands, others already calling the volunteer fire department. By the time the fire trucks rumbled down the dirt road, the blaze had grown too powerful to stop. Water hoses hissed, firefighters shouted commands, but their efforts could only contain the inferno, not save the barn. The air stank of charred wood and burnt corn, and the mournful sound of the barn roof collapsing under its own weight silenced the crowd for a moment. The farmer himself stood at the edge of the field, his face still, eyes reflecting the flames. To outsiders, he looked like a broken man watching a piece of his family's legacy disappear. But those who knew him better noticed the calm in his stance, the quiet resolve that suggested this wasn't the end of his story. The barn held memories, yes, but what it symbolized was far greater. It was his independence, his refusal to bow to an HOA president who had been tightening her grip on the neighborhood like a vice. It didn't take long for whispers to sharpen into accusations. The HOA president had fought him for months, criticizing every detail of his property, the way he stacked hay bales, the fact his tractors were parked in view, the sound of his farm equipment at dawn. She had threatened fines, sent angry letters, even called meetings to shame him in front of neighbors. And now, here was his barn, reduced to ash, on a night too still for lightning and too dry for a freak accident. The crowd exchanged uneasy glances, knowing exactly whose fingerprints this crime carried. If not literally, then in spirit. For the farmer, this was more than loss. It was a declaration of war. Standing there, silhouetted by the burning wreckage, he made no loud outburst, no desperate pleas. He simply watched, his silence heavier than any words could be. And in that silence, the seeds of a reckoning were already being planted. What the HOA president didn't know was that she hadn't just burned down a barn. She had struck the match that would ignite her own downfall. The HOA president was not the kind of woman anyone would describe as reasonable. In fact, she thrived on control, feeding off the fear and frustration of the people who lived under her watch. To her, the neighborhood wasn't a community, but a kingdom, and she reigned like a petty monarch with a clipboard and a thirst for power. She was the type of person who could take joy in writing up violations over the shade of a curtain, the placement of a trash can, or the sound of a dog barking after dusk. And when it came to the farmer, she saw him as her greatest challenge, the one man who refused to bow his head. That refusal gnawed at her. It made her furious because she was used to everyone folding under her constant barrage of threats and fines. For months, she singled him out, driving past his farm with her phone camera ready, snapping photos of tractors parked in the open or tools left leaning against a shed. Each complaint she filed carried the same venom. Non-compliant. Out of order. Unacceptable. Neighbors whispered that she had it out for him not just because of the so-called violations, but because his independence stood as an act of defiance. He didn't buy into her belief that every property had to look like a suburban magazine cover. His farm was functional, alive, and real, and that was something she could never control. She wielded the HOA rulebook like a weapon, but it wasn't enough. The farmer ignored her fines, laughed off her letters, and even turned down her veiled threats to take him to court. With each dismissal, her rage only grew. It was more than a matter of property codes at this point. It became personal. To her, he represented rebellion, and if she didn't break him, others might follow. That's when her tactics shifted from petty harassment to something far darker. She began to watch his property more closely, circling the neighborhood at odd hours, her headlights sweeping across his fields long after midnight. She made comments at HOA meetings, warning others that people like him were dangerous to the order she had built. Neighbors grew uneasy, but no one dared challenge her. They had seen what happened to anyone who did: endless fines, constant harassment, and social isolation. She had created an empire of fear, and most chose silence over confrontation, but her obsession with the farmer drove her over the line. The barn, she told herself, was a symbol of his resistance. It was old, stubborn, and stood proudly outside her sense of order. If she could erase it, she could erase his defiance, too. It wasn't about property anymore, it was about dominance, about proving that no one could withstand her. When the barn burned, she expected fear. She expected the farmer to finally crumble, to look at her with the same defeat she had drawn out of so many before him. What she didn't expect was silence. Not fear, not anger, just silence. And for the first time, that silence unsettled her. Because deep down, she knew she hadn't just won a battle, she had triggered a war. To most people in town, the farmer was just that, a farmer. A man who rose before dawn, worked his fields, and tended to the rhythms of the land with the patience of someone who understood time and seasons, not hours. He wore worn boots, drove a mud-splattered pickup, and rarely spoke unless he had something worth saying. The community knew him as steady, private, even a little mysterious, but no one ever suspected that behind that quiet exterior lived a man with a far greater presence than any of them imagined. Because by day he might have seemed like a humble landowner, but by profession he was one of the most feared federal judges in the region. His courtroom was legendary. Lawyers whispered his name with both dread and respect. He was known for his no-nonsense rulings, his sharp memory, and his refusal to bend under political pressure or emotional appeals. Criminals and corporations alike trembled when their cases landed in his court. Because his reputation was ironclad, once he set his sights on injustice, he dismantled it piece by piece until there was nothing left. But outside of that world, he preferred anonymity. Farming was his refuge, a way to ground himself in the simple and honest labor that had shaped his family for generations. He never boasted of his position, never flaunted his authority. He didn't need to. Power was most dangerous when it was quiet. That was the fatal mistake the HOA president made. She believed she was targeting a defenseless farmer, a man too stubborn or too poor to fight back through her system of fines and intimidation. She saw only the overalls and the dirt-stained hands. What she didn't see were the robes folded neatly in his closet, the shelves of law books in his study, or the federal badge that carried the weight of the United States government. She didn't know she was poking a bear that had the full reach of the law behind him. When the barn burned, he didn't storm into her office. He didn't shout or threaten. Instead, he retreated into silence, the same silence that had unnerved lawyers, witnesses, and defendants in his courtroom for decades. He watched, he listened, and he waited. But his mind was already working like the seasoned judge he was, cataloging evidence, considering precedent, and envisioning the moment when her arrogance would collide with reality. The irony wasn't lost on him. This woman, who prided herself on rules and regulations, had just committed the gravest violation of them all. She thought her position in the HOA made her untouchable, but he knew better. No local board, no petty position of neighborhood power could protect her from what was coming. The law doesn't care about titles, and he of all people understood how swiftly it could strip a tyrant of their throne. To the community, the truth about who he really was would come as a shock. To her, it would be a nightmare, because she hadn't just crossed a farmer. She had declared war on a federal judge, one with both the authority and the will to dismantle everything she had built. The days after the fire passed in a strange hush. For the neighbors, it was the aftermath of a tragedy, talk of insurance, rebuilding, and whether the farmer would finally give in to the HOA's grip. But for the farmer himself, the silence was strategic. He didn't argue, didn't point fingers, didn't even acknowledge the smug glances the HOA president threw his way as she drove past his property. Instead, he went about his routine, fixing fences, tending to the fields, appearing as though nothing had changed. Yet behind closed doors, the real work had begun. He had called in investigators, federal investigators, men and women who didn't answer to the local sheriff or bow to small-town politics. They combed through the ashes of his barn, taking samples, photographing burn patterns, and quietly building a case. What looked like smoldering rubble to the community was, to them, a crime scene waiting to be cracked open. The HOA president had no idea her every move was being watched. Phone records, bank transactions, late-night security footage, details she assumed would never matter, were suddenly becoming threads in a web she couldn't escape. The farmer judge knew exactly how cases like this unfolded. He'd seen it in his courtroom countless times, arrogance blinding the guilty until the law tightened around them like a noose. And now he was the one weaving the rope. He didn't need to raise his voice or issue warnings. His power wasn't in threats, it was in precision. He let the investigators do their work, knowing that every piece of evidence brought them closer to the truth everyone already suspected. Witness statements trickled in, neighbors recalling her car idling near the farm late at night, the smell of gasoline on the wind just before the fire, her public rants about that stubborn farmer who refuses to play by the rules. Each testimony was another nail in the coffin she had built for herself. Then came the legal filings. Quietly, methodically, documents began circulating through federal channels. Charges of arson, destruction of property, and abuse of authority. Words that carried weight far heavier than an HOA fine. Her smugness began to fade when the first official notice arrived at her door. What she thought was a petty game of intimidation had escalated into something she couldn't control. She tried to brush it off, claiming harassment, insisting she was being framed, but deep down, she knew she was trapped. The judge had played his hand flawlessly. He hadn't needed to confront her directly or engage in the petty warfare she thrived on. Instead, he had let the system he knew so well do the work. A system that didn't care about neighborhood politics or her self-proclaimed power. It only cared about facts, evidence, and justice. And as the case built momentum, the cracks in her empire began to show. Board members who once feared her distanced themselves, unwilling to be dragged into her mess. Neighbors she had tormented for years began to speak out, emboldened by the knowledge that her reign was faltering. What had once been her greatest weapon, fear, was slipping through her fingers. The law was coming for her, and it was coming fast. Her downfall did not come in a single dramatic moment. It came piece by piece, like a wall crumbling under its own weight. At first, the HOA president carried herself with the same arrogance she always had, strutting into meetings, barking at neighbors, and brushing off whispers about the investigation. But the tone of the community had shifted. Where once her threats had been met with silence, now there were murmurs of resistance. People who had been too afraid to speak began to share their own stories. Fines for trivial offenses, intimidation tactics, even harassment campaigns designed to break their will. Her empire of control was unraveling, not from outside pressure, but from the inside out. The charges against her became impossible to ignore. Court notices stacked on her desk. The same neighbors she had bullied were now testifying against her, their words sharpened by years of pent-up resentment. Evidence tied her to the fire. Security footage showing her car circling the neighborhood that night, fuel purchases that matched the accelerant found in the ashes, and her public rants that had practically announced her intentions. She tried every excuse, denial, deflection, even claiming she was being targeted because of her leadership. But the courtroom doesn't bend for ego, and this courtroom in particular belonged to the very man she had underestimated. The irony was almost poetic. She had spent her reign enforcing petty rules, pretending to uphold order, while behind her facade lay nothing but chaos and cruelty. And now, she stood stripped of power, facing a judge whose authority extended far beyond her narrow world. The neighbors who once trembled at her letters now watched as she was called to account, her voice shaking, her excuses falling flat against the weight of the evidence. For the first time, she wasn't the one dictating the terms. She was the one being judged. Meanwhile, the farmer judge's barn was rebuilt. Slowly but steadily, new beams rose where the old ones had fallen, stronger and taller than before. The community came together, lending hands and tools, not just to rebuild a structure, but to restore what had been stolen from them. Freedom from fear. As the roof went up, so did their spirits. The barn became a symbol not just of survival, but of defiance. A reminder that tyranny, no matter how small or local, could not stand forever. When the final verdict came, it was decisive. Convictions, fines, restitution, and a sentence that stripped the HOA president of everything she had clung to, her position, her authority, her carefully crafted illusion of power. She left the courthouse not as the feared queen of the neighborhood, but as a disgraced criminal whose name was now synonymous with shame. The community she once ruled celebrated her absence. Meetings grew friendlier, rules were relaxed, and the people finally felt like neighbors again instead of subjects under a tyrant. For the judge, there was no gloating, no grand speech. He simply returned to his farm, to his fields, and to the quiet life he had always cherished. But everyone knew the truth. The woman who thought she could burn him down had instead set fire to her own empire. And the man she had underestimated had reminded them all of a timeless truth. Justice, though patient, always arrives.